And Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you so much again
Okay,
for being with us today.
thanks, Angela. And if you could maybe monitor the chat and just let me know as questions come by, that would
Sure,
be helpful.
absolutely.
So we'll get started. So I'm here to talk about childhood disability benefits. And so we see in our program, obviously, we represent folks that are at the pretty much at the poverty level and below. Our medical legal partnership, we go up to 200% poverty, but most of the people that come to us don't have a lot of monthly income. And we've studies show that people with higher socioeconomic statuses have better health outcomes. So we can't always control what income clients have, but we try through our legal advocacy to improve health in that way. There are many determinants and factors that go into the health of a child, and income is one of them, but there are other things as well, housing, safety from violence, and so access to medical care. And so we look at all those factors, and our work really does improve health for children. Next slide. So, and poor health causes poverty. So 66% of bankruptcies filed were filed due to medical issues. We see a lot of debt issues in the work that we do. So next slide. I talked about some of the factors that influence children's health. So it could be educational factors, whether they're getting access to IEPs or accommodations in school, stability and safety. So are they safe from violence in the home, safe from drug use in the home? Do they have adequate housing? Are there repair issues with housing that need to be fixed? Do they have affordable housing? Do they have access to enough food or healthy food? Do they have access to Medicaid or to services and medical equipment under their Medicaid plan? And for the immigrants that we see, do they have access to allow them to get citizenship or other legal status here so that they can get the services they need? And finally, employment and income. So we do I'm talking to you today about SSI cases. So SSI can offer an important income, monthly income to a household who has a child with a disability. So the SSI program for kids is about a little over 50 years old. So it was established for kids and families, the kids under age 18 who are disabled and have limited income and resources. And by limited, I mean really limited. So SSI for a single person is $967. That's what the payment is capped at. The monthly income for families can be higher than that. It's really difficult to explain because they have deductions and things, but it's easy just to remember that if somebody has a lot of income, their child's not going to qualify for SSI or resources either. So the monthly benefit will be going up to $994 in 2026. There's also a resource limit. So that's $2,000 for a child that's living with one parent, and they give you an extra $1,000 if you're a child living with two parents. And I said that the benefit amount right now is capped at 967 in 2025, going up in 2026, but that benefit amount can also be lower depending on living situations. So if somebody is assisting mom and dad with paying their housing expenses, that SSI amount could be reduced by 1/3 of the benefit. If mom or dad have earned income or unearned income, again, that comes into play as well, and that can also decrease the amount of that benefit. Next slide.
Before we go on, back there is a
Yeah,
question. Can
okay.
you explain what is considered into the resource limit?
So there are some, that's a very good question because there are some resources that are exempt. So what they do look at is if mom or dad work, and I shouldn't just say mom or dad, obviously you all are kinship caregivers. So whoever the caregiver is, whether that's grandma, grandpa, uncle, aunt, they look at their income. So it could be earned income, it could be unearned income. They look at money that you have in the bank. So they look at CDs, stocks and bonds. So what is exempt? And a lot of our clients, most of the clients coming to us, they don't have stocks and bonds. They don't have a lot of money in the bank. So what they do look at is, or what they don't look at is, they will allow you to have one car, regardless of value, if that's the family vehicle. And now I believe they're even allowing two cars. I've noticed that on the most recent SSI application. They will allow you the house that you live in. So, but if you have another property, they will count that. So, and we've run into that issue before, and it's usually um, caregiver owns a house, lives with the child, and then a lot of times they'll own another property. Maybe they inherited it after their parent died, or it's a really junky property that they moved out of because it wasn't really habitable, but it's still listed as an asset in their name. Maybe it's not worth $3,000 or $4,000, but Social Security is still counting it as an asset. We just ran into an issue where dad had a motorcycle. And honestly, it was the one thing that he thought was keeping him sober. He was in a motorcycle club and he it wasn't in great shape, but that was one thing that was just really precious to him, and it was stopping him from getting SSI benefits from his very severely disabled child. But we were able to get an appraisal of that motorcycle. It was had a lot of repair issues, questionable whether it was all that safe for him to be riding it. But we ended up getting an appraisal that was below that $2,000. And so he was able to maintain that, and it did clear the way for the child to be approved for SSI benefits. So those are the kind of things. There's also, they don't look at $1,500 cash value in life insurance. You can have term life insurance. It's just that life insurance that builds cash value that they don't want you to have, or don't want you to have very much of it. Generally, the items in your house, your furniture and clothing and things like that, they're not looking at those as assets. They're mainly looking at liquid assets. What could you easily sell to get money, and what, for lack of a better word, shows up on the book? So can they see money in your bank account? Can they see stocks or bonds? So I hope that answered your question. So the SSI program was established so that parents with children with disabilities would have a sufficient income and resources. So a lot of the people we see, it is difficult for them to work because some of them are care providers for kids with disabilities. A lot of them are running back and forth to the children's hospital, sometimes staying overnight there, depending on what the child's issues are, or they're taking them to therapies. And so it can be very challenging for these folks to work. So this is one of the reasons behind the SSI program. In addition to, these kids tend to have higher monthly costs. Just they may have things that they need that aren't always covered by insurance. And so for a child to meet, there are very different standards for SSI for adults and kids. So the adult standard, which we're not focusing on today, looks mainly at, do you have a severe impairment that's severe enough to prevent you from doing work, not just the kind of work you did before, but any kind of work. So that's the adult standard. So obviously with kids, they're not looking at whether or not a child can work. Kids don't have an obligation to work. So if you're under 18, they're looking at whether you have any physical or mental impairment that causes what they call marked or severe functional limitations. So they have different categories of functioning, and I'll get into them a little bit later. So if you're marked or extreme in those categories, then they will find that you meet the qualifications. Or if you meet what is called a listing. So a listing is, they have several groupings of listings on the Social Security website and in the federal regulations for different areas. So there's, for instance, there's a grouping for mental health issues. There's a grouping for orthopedic issues. And if you're severe enough to meet the criteria in those listings, you'll automatically be approved. Frankly, most people that come to us are not as severe as would be required to meet a listing, but that's okay. There's another path to SSI, and that's through that functional analysis. So they do look at substantial gainful activity with kids. It is possible that kids could have income. So if there was say a child who had a disability and they were a child actor making money, then they would be screened out because you cannot make more than, in 2026, it will be going up to $1,690 a month. There's a higher SGA level for blind people that is $2,830. So if you're over that amount, they're going to deny you at the very first step. Again, there are a few exceptions to that, some deductions we can use, but for the most part, if you're over that amount, you're not going to be approved. So the second step is, do you have a severe impairment? So frankly, again, most people meet this step. So all you have to do to meet this step is to show that your impairment is preventing you from fully performing work activities. And so work activities are things like standing, sitting, lifting. Those are physical work activities. For less physical jobs, it could be hearing, seeing, understanding, concentrating, things like that. So those are the things they look at when they're determining whether you have a severe impairment. So for the children's SSI process, as I mentioned, the child has to meet a listing or medically equal a listing or functionally equal a listing. So again, what we're normally looking at with our cases is whether those kids are fitting into those functional categories. So functional equivalents, when they look at, so medical listings, as I said, those are listed on the Social Security website. They're also listed in the federal regulations at 42 USC. I don't remember the site, but if you look up 42 USC medical listings, you'll find those listings in there. And there are 14 different body systems, separate listings for adults and children. So to equal a listing, sometimes somebody has a condition that's not listed in the listings. And in that case, we've had people with rare conditions, they're not listed in those medical listings. So we look at what could be a close equivalent, and we can make an argument as to whether they meet that listing. Also, I didn't list on here compassionate allowances. So compassionate allowances are something developed by Social Security. It's probably been about 20 years now, but These have specifically been developed for more rare conditions. And if you can show that somebody even has that condition, because they tend to be for terminal or very severe conditions, that can be a pathway on to SSI as well. So, functional equivalence, when we're looking at functional equivalence for a child, we look at what is typical for a child of that age. So, what can an average 8-year-old do, and how is this child performing in comparison to that other child, that average child? So, we also look at the combined effects. So, sometimes somebody doesn't have an impairment with any one factor on its own, but they may have 8 or 9 disabilities when combined together could be disabling. Um, so, Social Security also looks at the help you receive. So, sometimes a child can perform an activity, but maybe they get a lot of help from a family or a teacher. They get accommodations in school to do that. So that all goes into that, factoring into that functional equivalence. So they look at how well a child can initiate or sustain or complete activities. So again, they're looking at structured settings. So maybe a child can remain still and concentrate, but that's because she's getting a lot of one-on-one attention from an aide in school or a lot of assistance or other accommodations. You're going to look at what kind of activities the child can perform independently, what kind of activities the child might need help with. So, for instance, there could be a child that's very independent, but that child uses a wheelchair. She gets along great in that wheelchair and can get out in the community, but Social Security acknowledges that child uses a wheelchair. Things are a little more difficult for her. She doesn't perform the activities the same way another child would, so she would likely qualify for SSI. Also, does it take longer for that child to perform activities? So maybe one child is able to dress herself in 5 minutes in the morning. That other child, maybe if she's trying to do that on her own, it's going to take 40 minutes. So that's important to look at as well. And that kind of goes along with the effort needed to perform that activity. Structured settings are big. So I do have some kids that are in self-contained classrooms, and that's really important because even if they're getting A's or doing well, they're not in a traditional classroom setting. They're getting significant accommodations to be able to perform. So they also look at our kids in residential facilities. How do they perform when you take them out of that structured setting? So we've had kids where we've tried to remove them and mainstream them into the traditional classroom, and it just doesn't work out for them. So that's important to note if you're looking at SSI and functioning. And it's very important to get information from teachers, from doctors, from other health professionals, counselors, therapists that may work with that child. Again, mom or dad or other caregiver always probably has that closest relationship with the child and can provide information, but frankly, Social Security wants to, not to say they don't trust that caregiver, but I think they want an independent assessment of that child and the child's functioning. So it's always helpful to have that additional information. So again, ability to perform activities independently is something that we look at. Can they perform those activities of daily living, getting dressed, feeding themselves, toileting, showering, that kind of thing, or do they need a lot of help? Do they need supervision to prevent harm? So we have kids like most of us, you could leave the room and leave your 12-year-old in the room alone. Some 12-year-olds know it may not be safe because of their disability, so they look at things like that. Or whether the child needs prompting to complete activities. I was talking to a mom last week who every night she has to remind the child to brush her teeth and how to brush her teeth. So if there's that constant prompting or assistance, their child just, it doesn't seem to settle in their brain how to perform those activities. That can be very important to look at. As well as I talked a little bit about assistive devices, so wheelchairs, canes, walkers, other pieces of medical equipment the child may need just to ambulate around independently. So Social Security looks at functional level in 6 different what they call domains. So there's acquiring and using information, attending and completing tasks. Basically, can you concentrate and pay attention? Interacting and relating with others. So how well do you socialize, not just with other kids, but with adults? Moving about and manipulating objects. So can you move around okay? Can you run, jump, do all those things we think of as kids doing? Can you throw a ball? Can you hit a ball with a bat? Can you kick a ball? Are you able to care for yourself and your health and physical well-being? So how are you frequently ill? Are you hospitalized? So those are things that they're looking at. And the functioning is going to differ depending on age. So Social Security looks at kids that are under 3, and then they divide them between age 3 and 6, between age 6 and 12, and between age 12 and 18. So obviously we expect more out of a 15-year-old than we do out of a 2-year-old. So the functioning is going to equal a listing if the child has what they call marked limitations in 2 domains, or they have an extreme limitation in 1 domain. So, to explain it in a very complex way, Social Security talks about being 2 standard deviations below the mean is what marked means. And you can see that on some professional tests, they will tell you whether a child's 2 standard deviations below. Otherwise, that term can be really hard to interpret. And with an extreme limitation, it's 3 standard deviations below the mean. So it doesn't mean the child has a complete lack of functioning in the area, but it just means that it's really extreme. It's interfering very seriously with that child's ability to independently initiate or sustain or do that activity. So, acquiring and using information, these are some examples for those of you that have kids or who have had kids, that age. I don't have kids, but I had a goddaughter that I spent a lot of time around. And when I think about where she was between these ages, I can remember her being able to rhyme words and point out different colors and use sentences to ask questions. And so if you have a child that's not able to do those things, that may be an indication that maybe they're markedly impaired or extremely impaired in that category. Next slide, and attending and completing tasks. So child should be able to focus on fun activities. Again, I noticed with my goddaughter, she was not as great at focusing on age activities at age 3 for any length of time. But at age 4, it was almost like somebody switched on a light switch, and all of a sudden she was sitting quietly as we would read a book or as we do another activity. So it can be different for different kids. but it could indicate if a child can't sit still to focus on even activities they enjoy, that maybe there's a problem in this category. Interacting and relating with others. So at this age, a child should be developing friendships with other kids. They should be able to speak clearly enough so that caregiver or other kids or adults can understand them, and they should be capable of showing affection, giving a hug to their caregiver, or, just capable of showing that to the caregiver or others. And moving about and manipulating objects. So at that age, a child should be getting along pretty well, walking, running, climbing stairs without a lot of supervision, able to use a zipper or other fasteners. Not that they might not sometimes need help still at that age, but they should be getting to the point where they're starting to at least attempt those activities and be able to get dressed and able to put on their shoes and other clothing. Health and physical well-being. So I've represented a few kids with with conditions that keep them sick a lot of the time. So you're going to look for kids that are absent from school a lot because they're sick. Kids who are in doctor therapy appointments quite a bit. So, or they have physical limitations. So I have kids that are taking medication for one reason or the other, for seizures, for ADHD, and they may be falling asleep in school. We've seen those cases. So those are all indications that maybe they're not functioning like an average child of that age in this health and well-being category. And caring for yourself. So again, some of the same things you see in the category where you're, moving about and manipulating, like, can you put on shoes? Can you do some things independently? And do you want to do things independently? So that's another thing I remember about my goddaughter. She got to age 3 and all of a sudden she wanted to do everything by herself. Um, Not everything was safe to do by herself. But you'll see that in most kids that get to that age. It seems like a switch gets switched on and they all of a sudden want to at least attempt to do things by themselves. And they should be able to understand things that are not safe for them. So usually by age 3, a child should know it's not safe to run into the road. It's not safe to just pick up anything and put it into your mouth. And so if you're seeing that maybe that's not the case, that might be an indication of a functional limitation in this domain. So this is just an example of a child that I had that I represented. So I've given him an assumed name, but he was 7 and he had both autism and anxiety. He had a lot of trouble developing friendships with other kids. He wanted really just to be alone. He had behavioral issues at school, had been disciplined for hitting or distracting other kids in the classroom. He had to be supervised at all times, or he ran off one time and actually ran into a pond, and it was just very concerning. So they had to keep a pretty close eye on him. He received assistance from a one-on-one aide at school, and he had spent a lot of his day in a special ed classroom. So, based on the categories of functioning that I talked about, do any of you want to put in the chat what domain he might be limited in, if any?
Any thoughts? Feel free to share out loud too.
Yeah, feel free to share out loud.
I would say severe simply because of the fact that he um, puts himself in danger unknowingly.
Right, so that could be part of caring for oneself. He didn't have an appreciation of danger, so I think you could make a good argument he was limited in that domain of functioning. And I was actually representing him not on an SSI issue. He'd already been approved for SSI, but I was representing him on a Medicaid waiver issue, trying to get services for him. I think you could also argue that he's limited in the interacting and relating with others. He's clearly not getting along with other kids, doesn't form relationships, has even been violent with some of those kids, and then probably also limited in the learning category because he did need a one-on-one aid at school and had some documented learning issues. So my other client, I've called her Ava. So she was an 11-year-old, had sickle cell, and so she was frequently absent from school. She had been a good student, but because of her illnesses and hospitalizations, she was homeschooled and not always able to get schooling at all because she would be so sick. So she was falling behind in her schoolwork and might not be able to advance, wasn't able to advance to the next grade. Does anybody want to take a stab at what domains she was limited in?
Um, I see like schooling is medical domain.
Yes, so the medical domain, we call that the health and well-being, but yes, so she was definitely, I argued she was extremely limited and we were able to get her on SSI for that reason. But also it was beginning to impact her learning. So acquiring and using information was another domain where she was limited.
Yeah,
Uh,
and you said social domain too.
Yeah, I see somebody says social domain. So, and you could make that argument, but she wasn't limited in her, I guess she was limited in her capacity just because she was so sick. She didn't have documented when she was in school. She did have friends, was able to communicate with people pretty well, communicated with her caregiver pretty well. So was probably closer to say that she was limited in the health and well-being as well as in that learning category. So it's really quite common for people to apply for SSI benefits and then they come to us and they've been denied. And if you have applied for benefits on behalf of a child that you're providing care for, don't get overly discouraged if those benefits have been denied. Most people are denied at the first two levels of Social Security, what we call the field office, which is that local Social Security office, because unless you meet a listing, Social Security doesn't necessarily at that level go any farther to do that functional analysis like a judge would do. So your last level of appeal, or the level of appeal where we represent people, it's not the last level appeal, is at the ALJ. So that's the administrative law judge stage. At that stage, we represent the person at a hearing, and that's nowadays, that's mainly either by telephone or it's by Zoom that we do those hearings. And that's where the judge will take that functional evidence into account. So usually before the hearing, we try to have all of that lined up. So I try to have information from a therapist if they're seeing a therapist. We have all those medical records. We try to get the opinion of the teachers or other people that are regularly having contact with this child. So we have everything lined up to show just how they're limited in those functional domains. So these are the levels of appeal here. So you can do a reconsideration. That's what you file on your first denial. On your second denial, you appeal to that administrative law judge where you have the hearing. So that's where we have our most success. There is a level after that. It's called the appeals council. That is what we call a paper review. So there's no hearing. They just look at the decision and the medical evidence to see whether they think the judge made an error. This can be a hard level of appeal. Not a lot of cases get overturned here. They do sometimes get remanded, which means they're kicked back for another hearing if the appeals council finds that the judge missed something. And so we get another bite at the apple that way. If all those levels are unsuccessful, you can appeal to federal court. That is a long process. So start to finish, last one I did took about 5 years, so it's not quick. So some people choose to just start the process over again. That is another option that you can take. So one thing that you may find is if you have a child that you're providing care for that's already on SSI benefits, so kids have their cases reviewed. It's usually once every 3 years on average, depending on what the disability is. So if it's something very profound, so if the child was born with quadriplegia, it may be more like a 7-year review date because frankly, that's not a condition that's going to improve. They do also look every year, they're looking at income to make sure that child's income and resources is not above the allowable limit. But they will also do what's called a continuing disability review sometimes. And that means they're looking at whether does this child still have a condition that qualifies her for benefits. So one area where I see kids tend to make improvement is sometimes when kids are young, maybe their speech isn't where it should be. They're not speaking enough words, they're not speaking intelligible words, and so they're placed into speech therapy. And then they make a pretty good improvement. And if that was the only thing that was impacting them, then after that disability review, Social Security may say, no, you don't qualify. But what I've also seen is some things haven't been diagnosed yet. So we can't diagnose autism or things like that or mental health issues when a child is too young. So their speech may improve, but it may be possible that now they're 6 or 7 and they've acquired other disabilities. So we can also introduce evidence of those other disabilities and say, okay, the speech impairment improved, but now they have autism and it's affecting them in this functional way, or now they have ADHD, and this is how they're being affected by that impairment. So it's very important when you get that paperwork, if you get continuing disability review paperwork, they call it CDR for short, that you complete and return that paperwork. If you don't do that, they may propose you for termination. And they'll have you sign medical releases so they can pull those medical records and review them to determine whether the child still meets the standard. So if they determine the child has improved, then they will propose the child for termination. And it's very important when you get proposed for termination, they put in small print on that notice that you have 10 days to appeal and still get your financial benefit coming in. You have 60 days to appeal the determination, only 10 to get those cash benefits coming in. So if for some reason you've missed that appeal deadline, and there's a good reason for missing that appeal deadline, we can sometimes ask for what's called a good cause exception. So I'll give you an example. So this wasn't a child's case, but it's still applicable. So I had a young guy in his 20s. he was proposed for termination, severe mental health issues. When he got paperwork from Social Security or another agency, he would get so stressed out that he would just set it to the side. He couldn't open it. He couldn't deal with it for a while. When he finally did deal with it, he brought it to me. He was beyond the appeal deadline by about 4 months. So I contacted his therapist. She wrote a really helpful letter saying what his mental health conditions caused him to do, that he would get stressed out, that he wouldn't act on that paperwork. And they allowed that good cause appeal. So we were able to get his benefits coming in, and we did eventually get his benefits back for him. So his benefits, he was approved as being permanently disabled. So hopefully, as you go through this process, they'll say, you know, we don't need to do anything. We still think the child's disabled. But if they do think there's been what they call medical improvement, just remember that there's that very short 10-day window to file that appeal to keep getting those benefits coming in during the pendency of the hearing, because these hearings take longer to schedule than the initial applications for SSI. So it can take up to a year, even sometimes a year and a half to get in for a hearing on these. So you do want to make sure that hopefully you're still receiving that benefit while you wait for the hearing. So here's just a little review of the process. Does the child have a severe impairment? If yes, you're going to go on to the next step. If no, they're going to find the child's not disabled. You're going to look at listings. Then you're going to look at functional impairments. And that's the basic process for children. And then these are your appeal rights for cessation are the same as they are for an initial case. So you've got the right to file an appeal, and you've got the right to ask for a hearing. So any questions? I don't know if there were any other questions in the chat or if people have questions now.
Yes, feel free. We have some time left. So if anyone has questions, I don't think I saw any other questions in the chat.
Okay.
But feel free to come off mute, or if anyone has like experiences to share in this process, feel free to share as well.
And I should also say that we handle 32 counties in Western Ohio, and then we go out east as far as Mansfield, which you can see from our map there. Those are our service areas. So we do handle over a third of the state of Ohio. So if you do reside in our service area and you meet our income qualifications and you have kids that have SSI issues, or you have kids that have other legal issues. So I'm just talking to you about SSI today, but we handle a range of issues for kids. And that could be, it doesn't have to be directly the child. So if mom is needing a divorce because dad is violent, then that impacts the child. You know, that's an issue where we could represent mom on that divorce. If the child needs help with an IEP or some advocacy for an accommodation in school, that's an issue. If the child needs an electric wheelchair and you're having trouble getting that approved through Medicaid, that's another type of issue. If you are a kinship caregiver and you need to get guardianship of a child, that's a case we could handle. So and we handle housing and a variety of other things. So we do, I think I can speak for Joe and myself that we try to be as inclusive with what we do as we can. there are some things we don't do. So we don't do criminal cases. We're not permitted to do that. But other than that, we do a range of civil legal issues, and we can at least usually offer at least a level of brief service counsel and advice, even if we can't do full service on cases. And we're also happy to refer you on if you don't live in our service area. So I have contacts across the state at different legal aid organizations. So we can also refer you on with no guarantees as to what their priorities are, but can refer you to the legal aid that's in your service area that might be able to help.
Amazing. Such great resources that you all offer.
Thank you, Becky.
Thank you so much.